Welcome to Truth Behind History, where we uncover the hidden forces shaping our world. Today, we're diving into a topic that sounds like science fiction but is very real: mass surveillance. If you've ever felt like someone is always watching, well, you might not be wrong. Throughout history, governments have used surveillance to control populations, maintain power, and suppress dissent. But in the modern age, it's evolved into something far more advanced, far more pervasive, and, for many, far more concerning. Technology has transformed surveillance from simple informants and spies into a sophisticated web of cameras, AI, and data collection systems that track billions of people every single day. We'll be tracing the history of mass surveillance, looking at how it has escalated with technological advancements, and breaking down the real impact it has on society today. From historical secret police networks to modern AI-powered facial recognition, the tools of control have evolved, but the purpose remains the same. So, how did we get here? And what does it mean for the future? Let's start by looking at the origins of mass surveillance, the early methods used to monitor and control people long before the internet even existed. Long before security cameras, GPS tracking, and AI-driven monitoring, governments relied on more direct and brutal forms of surveillance. These methods weren't about collecting data, they were about control, and they were used to suppress opposition, enforce laws, and maintain power. One of the earliest examples in the United States was slave patrols in the 1700s. These patrols acted as an early form of law enforcement, but their true purpose was far more sinister. They were designed to track, monitor, and control enslaved African Americans, ensuring they didn't escape or organize rebellions. This was a form of mass surveillance based on fear, physical enforcement, and community informants. Fast forward to the 20th century, and surveillance became more institutionalized. In the 1950s and 60s, the FBI launched COINTELPRO, a covert program aimed at infiltrating and disrupting political movements. Civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and anyone deemed a threat to the U.S. government were closely watched, harassed, and even blackmailed. Martin Luther King Jr. was a key target, with the FBI going so far as to send him anonymous letters urging him to commit suicide. At the same time, the CIA ran Operation Chaos, targeting American citizens involved in civil rights and anti-war activism. This was illegal. Spying on domestic citizens went against everything the Constitution stood for, but that didn't stop them. The goal was to prevent these movements from gaining momentum, proving that surveillance isn't just about security, it's about control. And then, of course, there was East Germany's Stasi, which operated from 1950 to 1990. The Stasi created one of the most invasive surveillance states in history, recruiting thousands of informants, bugging homes, and even opening personal mail to keep an iron grip on the population. If you spoke out against the government, you could disappear overnight. Surveillance has always existed as a tool of power. But as technology advanced, it became far more efficient. Governments no longer needed spies on every street corner. They could now watch entire populations without them even realizing it. Now, let's move forward in time and see how modern technology has supercharged government surveillance. The 21st century didn't just bring better phones and faster internet, it brought surveillance capabilities that previous governments could only dream of. What once required physical informants and wiretaps can now be done at an unimaginable scale, thanks to technology. After the 9th of November, the US government vastly expanded its surveillance operations. One of the biggest shifts came with the NSA's warrantless wiretaps, where intelligence agencies were allowed to monitor digital communications, phone calls, emails, texts, without a warrant. The justification? National security. The reality? Mass surveillance of American citizens on an unprecedented level. Then there was the USA Patriot Act of 2001, a sweeping piece of legislation that gave the government broad authority to collect personal data, track financial transactions, and even monitor library records. It was marketed as a way to fight terrorism, but in practice, it gave law enforcement nearly unrestricted access to the private lives of ordinary people. And it didn't stop there. Facial recognition and AI-powered surveillance have taken monitoring to a whole new level. Governments around the world now use AI to scan faces in public spaces, track movements, and even predict behaviors. If you've ever walked through an airport or a major city, chances are you've been scanned, logged, and identified, whether you knew it or not. But perhaps the most insidious form of surveillance is something people willingly participate in every day: surveillance capitalism. Companies like Google, Facebook, and countless others collect vast amounts of user data, from search history to purchasing habits to GPS locations. And here's the kicker: much of that data is freely shared with governments. This is mass surveillance in the digital age. It's no longer just about law enforcement, it's a business, a political tool, and a method of shaping human behavior. But if you think this is limited to the US, think again. The next section takes us global, showing how surveillance has become a worldwide phenomenon. If government surveillance wasn't unsettling enough, let's talk about something even more invasive: spyware. Imagine a tool so advanced that it can hack into a phone without the user ever clicking a link, opening a file, or even realizing it happened. That's exactly what Pegasus is. Developed by NSO Group, an Israeli cybersecurity firm, Pegasus is no ordinary spyware. It can turn on a phone's camera and microphone remotely, read text messages, track location, and even access encrypted communications, all without leaving a trace. And the worst part? It has been used against journalists, activists, and politicians all over the world. One of the most shocking cases was the Catalan Gate scandal, revealed in 2022. Dozens of politicians from Catalonia, a region of Spain with a strong independence movement, were secretly targeted using Pegasus. This wasn't about security, this was about political control. And it's not just Spain. Pegasus has been found on the phones of dissidents in Saudi Arabia, human rights activists in Mexico, and even high-ranking officials in the European Union. Governments and intelligence agencies worldwide have used this technology to silence critics, monitor opposition, and suppress dissent. The revelations about Pegasus led to global outrage. Human rights organizations called for regulation, governments scrambled to distance themselves, and tech companies like Apple and WhatsApp sued NSO Group for targeting their users. But here's the real question: if one spyware tool like Pegasus can do all this, what else is out there that we don't even know about? The reality is, government surveillance is no longer limited to cameras on the street. It has moved into our pockets, our private conversations, and our personal devices. And nowhere is that more evident than in one of the world's most surveilled nations, India. If there's one country that has embraced mass surveillance on a massive scale, it's India. With over 1.4 billion people, tracking and monitoring its population is no small task, but the Indian government has developed some of the most extensive surveillance programs in the world to do just that. One of the most significant is Aadhaar, the world's largest biometric database. Aadhaar assigns every Indian citizen a 12-digit identification number linked to their fingerprints, iris scans, and personal information. On the surface, it's meant to streamline government services, making it easier for people to access welfare, open bank accounts, and verify their identity. But in reality, Aadhaar has raised serious privacy concerns, with reports of data leaks, unauthorized access, and even private companies tapping into the system. And that's just the beginning. India has rapidly expanded its use of AI-driven facial recognition, installing high-tech cameras across cities, transportation hubs, and public events. These cameras don't just record, they identify individuals in real time, cross-checking their faces against vast government databases. In some cases, authorities have used this technology to track down political protesters and journalists critical of the government. But what makes India unique in the surveillance game is its heavy use of internet shutdowns. Whenever there is political unrest, riots, or mass protests, the government simply cuts off internet access. India has led the world in internet shutdowns for years, using them as a tool to prevent dissent, limit communication, and suppress opposition movements. Of course, none of this comes without backlash. Activists and legal experts argue that India's rapid expansion of surveillance is eroding privacy rights, with minimal oversight or accountability. The courts continue to debate the fine line between national security and individual freedom, but one thing is clear: India's surveillance state is only growing. And India isn't alone. Around the world, governments are building surveillance networks that would make George Orwell himself shudder. But they're not doing it alone. In many cases, they have help from the biggest tech companies on the planet. Government surveillance is powerful, but when big tech gets involved, it becomes unstoppable. The biggest names in Silicon Valley, Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, aren't just selling products. They're collecting data on billions of people. And in many cases, that data is shared with governments, either voluntarily or through secret programs. Every time you search on Google, like a post on Facebook, or ask Siri a question, you're generating data. That data tells companies who you are, what you like, where you go, and even what you might do next. And while most people assume this information is just used for targeted ads, the truth is, governments have found ways to tap into it, too. One of the biggest revelations about this came from Edward Snowden in 2013, when he exposed a secret US government program called PRISM. PRISM allowed the NSA to directly access user data from major tech companies, including Microsoft, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, Apple, and more. This meant emails, messages, video calls, and even stored files were being collected without users knowing. And it's not just the US, China, Russia, and other surveillance-heavy nations work closely with domestic tech companies to build systems that monitor their populations. In China, apps like WeChat and Alibaba track every transaction, while Russia's SORM system forces internet providers to store and share user data with the government. Of course, not everyone is okay with this. Privacy advocates, legal experts, and even some whistleblowers have called out the growing ties between governments and corporations, arguing that this level of surveillance is dangerous, unchecked, and a direct threat to democracy. But despite public outrage, data collection continues to grow, driven by both government demands and corporate profit motives. And this isn't just happening in a few countries, it's part of a global surveillance network that connects governments all over the world. Which brings us to the next piece of the puzzle, how surveillance has gone international, with some of the world's biggest powers spying not just on their own people, but on each other. Surveillance isn't just a national issue, it's an international game, where world powers monitor not just their own people, but each other. Governments form alliances to share intelligence, track individuals across borders, and even spy on foreign leaders. Let's take a look at some of the most powerful surveillance networks in the world. One of the most infamous is China's social credit system. This isn't just about cameras watching the streets, it's a massive digital monitoring system that tracks citizens' behaviors, from their financial transactions to their social media posts. The government assigns scores to individuals, rewarding good behavior, and punishing those who criticize the state. Book a train ticket after posting anti-government content online? You might find yourself banned from traveling. It's a surveillance system that goes beyond observation, it actively controls people's lives. Then there's Russia's SORM, a national surveillance program that monitors phone calls, emails, and internet activity. Internet providers are required to store user data for years and grant Russian intelligence full access whenever requested. Privacy? Not in Russia. But the most powerful surveillance alliance of all is the Five Eyes Alliance, a decades-old intelligence sharing network between the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These countries have agreed to share massive amounts of surveillance data with each other, effectively creating a global web of monitoring. If one country isn't allowed to spy on its own citizens, another member of the alliance can do it for them and share the information back, a legal loophole that makes mass surveillance even harder to escape. Of course, not all countries are leaning into mass surveillance. In Europe, GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, laws have been put in place to protect user data, limit government overreach, and hold corporations accountable for privacy violations. But even these protections have limits, especially when intelligence agencies argue that surveillance is necessary for national security. The bottom line? There's no escaping mass surveillance. Whether it's your own government, a foreign power, or a tech company selling your data, someone, somewhere, is watching. And as surveillance technology continues to evolve, the world is beginning to resemble something eerily similar to Orwell's 1984. Now, let's take a look at some of the most chilling parallels between Orwell's fiction and the world we live in today. George Orwell's 1984 was supposed to be a warning, not an instruction manual, but today, his dystopian vision is shockingly real. Governments control narratives, technology tracks our every move, and censorship is used to silence opposition. Let's break down some of the eerie parallels between 1984 and our world today. In Orwell's world, thought crime was the idea that even thinking the wrong thing, doubting the party, questioning authority, was punishable. Sound familiar? Today, social credit systems, censorship laws, and online surveillance punish individuals for expressing unpopular opinions. Speak out against the wrong government, and you could be deplatformed, blacklisted, or even imprisoned. Then there were the telescreens, devices that monitored citizens 24/7, watching, listening, and tracking. In 2024, we don't need telescreens, we carry them in our pockets. Smartphones, smart TVs, and IoT devices constantly collect data on what we say, where we go, and even what we look at. Voice assistants like Alexa and Siri listen for commands, but do they stop listening when you're done? And let's not forget Newspeak, Orwell's idea that by manipulating language, governments could control public thought. Today, media outlets, social platforms, and even AI-driven fact-checkers control narratives, deciding what information is misleading and what ideas are too dangerous to be heard. In some places, using certain words online can even get you banned or arrested. And of course, there's Big Brother, the all-seeing, all-knowing figure of authority that watches everyone, all the time. AI-powered facial recognition, drone surveillance, and real-time data tracking have made this more real than Orwell could have imagined. Whether it's China's state-run monitoring, the NSA's mass data collection, or private companies feeding information to intelligence agencies, Big Brother isn't coming, he's already here. So, what happens next? Is there any way to push back against the rise of mass surveillance? In the next section, we'll explore the fight for privacy, and whether we're already too late. If mass surveillance is this widespread, does that mean resistance is futile? Not necessarily. Around the world, activists, tech developers, and even lawmakers are pushing back against the rise of an all-seeing state. But the battle for privacy is an uphill fight, and time is running out. One of the biggest efforts comes from privacy-focused technology. Tools like VPNs, encrypted messaging apps like Signal, and decentralized web platforms help users shield their data from prying eyes. Unlike mainstream tech companies that collect and sell user information, these platforms are designed to limit tracking and protect anonymity. But they only work if people actually use them, and many don't realize how vulnerable they are until it's too late. Then there's the legal battle. Organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, and Privacy International fight against government overreach, taking surveillance programs to court and pushing for stronger privacy laws. The GDPR laws in Europe were a huge victory, forcing companies to be transparent about how they collect and use data. In the US, however, things are trickier. Lobbyists for big tech companies have spent millions fighting against stronger privacy protections. But here's the real problem: surveillance is evolving faster than the laws can keep up. Governments always claim that surveillance is about national security, preventing crime, or protecting the public. And while those concerns are valid, history has shown that mass surveillance often expands far beyond its original purpose. What starts as a way to stop criminals can quickly become a tool for controlling speech, monitoring political opposition, and restricting freedoms. So, where does that leave us? The truth is, privacy is a privilege that is disappearing fast. Without major resistance, mass surveillance will only become more advanced, more widespread, and more normalized. We've already seen how easy it is for people to accept invasive tracking in exchange for convenience, whether it's through social media, smart devices, or digital payment systems. The question isn't whether we can stop mass surveillance, it's whether we're even willing to try. But before we wrap this up, let's look at the big picture. Where does this all lead? And what does the future of surveillance look like if nothing changes? So, where does this all lead? If history has taught us anything, it's that once governments and corporations gain power over information, they rarely give it up. Surveillance isn't just about security, it's about control, and as technology advances, that control will only become more sophisticated, seamless, and unavoidable. The future of mass surveillance likely includes AI-driven predictive policing, where governments don't just watch what people do, but try to predict crimes before they happen, a concept straight out of Minority Report. Advanced brain-computer interfaces could one day make even our thoughts vulnerable to monitoring, breaking down the final barrier of personal privacy. And with the rise of biometric tracking, digital IDs, and cashless economies, opting out of the system may become impossible. But the most disturbing part? Many people won't resist. The slow creep of surveillance has made privacy seem like an outdated concept. Convenience, safety, and entertainment have made most of us willing participants in our own monitoring. The question isn't whether Big Brother is watching, the question is whether we've already accepted it. But what do you think? Is mass surveillance an inevitable part of the modern world, or is there still time to fight back? Let me know in the comments. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on future deep dives into history's most controversial topics. Also, check out some of my other videos. If you love history, you won't want to miss them. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History, and I'll see you in the next one.